So this paper examines the philosophical approach to the conservation of modern architecture. It attempts to briefly describe the status quo, to identify the issues arising from this position, and to question how we may progress towards a shared vision and approach for conserving modern heritage. And as you all know, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion around this topic. And whilst it's always useful to reflect on what we're doing and how, I think it has become somewhat circuitous. And I think one of the things that's important now is that we start to focus our efforts on solving the problems that create some of the philosophical stumbling blocks, and so we could move towards a shared approach and vision for conserving modern heritage. This time lag between a building's creation and its protection and conservation has never been as compressed as it is for the modern era. And these are just some of the examples of well-known buildings that are achieving recognition and protection locally, nationally, and internationally on the World Heritage List. The emergence of a surprising number of local, national and international organisations dedicated to conserving modern heritage, such as these ones that are shown at the screen, I haven't captured all of them, these are the international ones, demonstrates an interest in and a comfort with identifying the recent past as important, one would assume. Yet this short time gap between the creation and heritage recognition has certainly affected our attitude to the modern era's importance and how it should be conserved. Many national and local authorities now include 20th century heritage within their listing programs. However, in some parts of the world, there's still nervousness about protecting anything but the icons of the modern era. Modernism has failed us. There's so much of it. We don't like it. It's too hard to conserve, are kind of some of the things that we hear. In many areas too, 20th century structures dominate the urban landscape, and for older generations, their realisation may be a living but not necessarily a positive memory. Large-scale urban renewal, which swept away the heritage of previous eras, has prejudiced some communities against what replaced it. These places are yet to go through this kind of natural selection process where the survivors are automatically appreciated as heritage places. Some of these issues that I mentioned previously raise questions about what to protect and how to establish comparative levels of significance within the existing frameworks used in the heritage identification and assessment process. In the meanwhile, this kind of rapid pace of change means that we are losing important places, or in some instances allowing irreparable damage that erodes the significance of these buildings. The session that's dedicated to identification, protection and interpretation is going to flesh these issues out in more detail. The technical and physical challenges posed by the conserving 20th century places are undoubtedly where the most difficult philosophical conflicts arise. In identifying where the conservation of traditional and modern heritage differs, I think this is where it's most distinct. So expanding the repertoire of knowledge to encompass modern construction systems and materials is clearly needed, and this is argued in the background paper by Jeff Cody and Theo Pruden. The move from craft-based to industrialised construction, as discussed in Kyle Normanden's paper, and all the implications that this has brought, has resulted in a building stock with a reduced life cycle. Shorter cycles of repair, higher rates of obsolescence, both functional and materially, all lead to higher costs in the long term and more change over time. Over the last 20 years, I think there has been limited advancement in developing new and adapting existing repair methods to conservation needs, and some of the early efforts in the 90s, I think, have lost steam. We do need leadership to reinvigorate this work. It's also important to learn from how similar issues have been dealt with in the past, as there are examples of how materials with limited durability or availability from other eras have been dealt with. There are a number of other issues that are outlined in my paper that I don't have time to go through now that are hampering physical repair in ways that maximises authenticity, and there is effort needed to address these. Recent deliberations have shifted from the focus on the materiality dilemma and to this issue of obsolescence and use. And I think some of the early conservation issues where we were dealing with the most iconic sites and where we really were demanding stringent application of conservation principles Therefore, this issue of balancing material and design authenticity was occupying a lot of the discussions. But as John Allen discussed in his keynote at the Docomomo conference in Helsinki recently, now that we're dealing with those places whose survival is reliant on their ability to accommodate change for new purposes, the conversation has shifted more to this issue of adaptive reuse. Conservation for the bulk of the world's protected places and for the majority of practitioners, however, has always been about managing change in a way that retains significance, be they industrial sites, cultural landscapes, modern buildings or urban areas. The explosion of building types over the 20th century to provide for new ways of living and working, and this centrality of functionalism within the modernist ideology are often cited as problems relating to specifically to modern buildings. However, it is debatable whether functionality and therefore adaptability are any more problematic for modern buildings than those of other eras, and I know not everyone agrees with me on that, but there is a large body of information on successful adaptive reuse of historic buildings that is also relevant for modern buildings. Access to successful case studies that exemplify some of the acknowledged specific issues faced by modern buildings would be a very useful addition to the literature. And the case study that's going to be presented on Toronto Tower Project demonstrates how this has been achieved at a city scale. These challenges all trigger questions about whether conserving modern heritage should follow existing approaches or if it demands a new paradigm. Modern architecture has attracted a new generation of practitioners to its conservation. Certainly through my education, and I think this continues, that the influence of modernism is strong in contemporary architectural practice, and architects practicing are also engaged in the conservation of modern heritage. The swelling of the ranks of those practicing in this area with architects who are perhaps less familiar with conservation theory, methodology and practice, but who bring a deep understanding of modernist theory, has fueled this debate and some of the calls for specific doctrinal texts to guide modern heritage's conservation. Those conversant with conservation practice have argued that the existing conservation principles work pretty well and that it's counterproductive to identify modern heritage as different and define a separate set of principles. The injection of new blood into the comparatively small and, dare I say, sometimes insular conservation fraternity has served to catalyse a re-evaluation of some of the existing manifestos and tools and highlighted areas of confusion or where conservation hasn't been well integrated into general planning, development and architectural practice. The confluence of these sectors provides opportunities for us, I think, and in fact that's the very reason I find this area of practice so interesting, because it enables us to help integrate conservation into general architectural practice more broadly, and I think it helps to reinforce the fact that conservation is in fact a highly creative process. Docomomo, which was formed in '89, as Anna said, of which many of us are members, has been hugely influential, creating a network of academics and practitioners that has catalysed action within and across its 60 member countries. And I think what is really interesting about Docomomo, and has perhaps set the scene in this regard, is that it is constructed on this different premise from perhaps other conservation groups, because it promotes the continuum of the modernist philosophy and simultaneously is attempting or interested in its conservation. It brings contemporary architects and critics who are proponents of modernism together with historians and conservationists. The architects of the 20th century whose work we're now conserving have also played a really important role in the conservation process. First, by advocating for the protection of their own buildings. Second, through a series of high-profile bequeathals of their own houses, and these sometimes come with very specific conditions attached to them. And third, by providing access to living memory about design, construction and materiality of their buildings. As those of us that have been involved in this process know, some architects faced with the conservation of their own buildings seek to improve them. Some will want to evolve them, introducing new architectural ideas that they have developed through the span of their work. And whilst it's obviously very important to engage with the creators where possible, it's also important to be able to place their advice in a framework or context for making conservation decisions, and to recognise that we do have different perspectives between the creator and the conservator. The engagement of the second generation of architects' families, who are the guardians of a number of important houses, is another interesting influence. The case study on the Sydney Opera House, which will be presented soon, demonstrates a mechanism for integrating the architect's vision into the conservation of the building, which I think is very interesting. Arguments about the distinct nature of modern heritage, together with some very difficult challenges, have in some instances led to a softening of the application of some of the most fundamental principles of conservation. Conservers found do as little as possible and only as much as necessary, just a couple of examples. The replacement of original materials, which were cheap and readily available, particularly in the post-war era, with more luxurious alternatives based on the idea that the architect would have done it if the materials were available and affordable, is a kind of typical example of that. The question is whether we've been making excuses about what can or cannot be achieved, as we've not been willing, or really we haven't been able to tackle some of the impediments to achieving good conservation. Will future generations look back and criticise us for giving up too easily, for not being conservative enough, or perhaps the reverse of being too precious? I think only time will tell. But new knowledge will inevitably change what's possible. Better information about how materials deteriorate and potential repair methods will shift opinion. What may seem too difficult or too expensive now may become easier, cheaper, and more widely available. New non-destructive diagnostic tools, the wider application and development of specific methods such as cathodic protection, this is an example for the repair and preventative approach to steel frame and concrete buildings. I think all of these things will continue to reduce the impact of repair on historic fabric. Future technologies and repair methods and materials will inevitably make some of our actions seem heavy-handed in the way our generation has critiqued the conservation work from previous eras. So I think what we need to be able to do is, and willing to do, is to push the boundaries, to undertake research, to broker new approaches with industry, and to question this status quo. We also need to create a market for these methods so that the industry is encouraged to work with us. And these are some of the challenges that we want to be tackling over the next couple of days. My thesis is that it would be helpful to move towards a shared view on approaching the conservation of modern heritage, because I think the lack of understanding about the approach to the identification of modern heritage and the absence of thematic frameworks, as Sheridan has already said, for assessment, means that seminal buildings such as Alba Alta's Palmio Sanatorium and examples of Le Corbusier's work remain absent from the World Heritage List. Shared understanding of approach brings consistency by decision makers. Nervousness about the ability of these buildings to meet current conservation standards during repair has reduced support for their protection. In many countries, government owns a large proportion of the important modern building stock and should be leading by example. But government asset managers have generally been slow to formally recognise their own modern heritage assets and put in place frameworks for their care. With an ever-shrinking public purse, the delivery of services will be a higher priority than conservation of public assets. I think that's unavoidable. And as public services contract, publicly owned buildings are being decommissioned, and government can be reluctant to transfer the perceived burden of heritage protection onto the private sector, and are also concerned about loss of profit on sales. And if you've ever been in that position with government, you'll know what a lot of pressure can be brought to bear on that. Declining public funds for heritage conservation means heritage increasingly has to pay its own way in the market economy. Agreeing on the approach, securing it in legislation with clear policies and consistent application is therefore ever important if we really want to secure conservation outcomes. Lack of shared vision between planners, assessors, conservators, architects results in conflict, confusion, and ultimately poor support. Given the scale and complexity of some modern buildings, cost is often a defining factor. And whilst we continue to promulgate the differences between modern heritage and that of the more distant past, I think what we're doing is reducing certainty and consistency in practice. The values-based approach to conservation provides the framework for conservation internationally and is now standard practice in many places. Some countries have specific principles that are enshrined in legislation or other means so that they guide day-to-day practice. captured in national charters such as the Australian Borough Charter, the China Principles, English Heritage's Conservation Principles, the Canadian Historic Places Standards and Guidelines, and they're just a few of the English-speaking ones. These all define a very similar process for conservation, commencing with the identification of the heritage significance of the place. This is just the chart from the Borough Charter. I could have picked any of them. I just happen to have this one because I'm from there. This very simple and basic concept of values-based conservation is that by understanding what's important about a place and the degrees of significance, you can make rational decisions about how to conserve it. Like the Venice Charter, from which many of these documents are derived, they advocate a cautious approach, doing as little as possible and only as much as necessary, the need for informed conservation based on good analysis and investigation, and skilled input. And Sheridan's already mentioned the Madrid document, but it arose out of the need to demonstrate how the fundamentals of conservation practice could apply to modern heritage. And we had some quite different views within the ICOMOS committee, and I am a member of that, about the need for such a text. But it has been widely embraced, and as Sheridan said, it's been translated now into 6 languages. For those countries or practitioners who are unfamiliar with the values-based approach or have legislation which doesn't yet recognise younger heritage places, the Madrid document has proven a really important tool for advocating for modern heritage. The Madrid document provides a basis for identification via heritage assessment and steps you through these usual process of conservation, and has helped to reach new groups of practitioners who are involved in modern heritage. So some of the questions that we've been talking about in the ICOMOS committee are whether the document should be codified as a charter, should it be expanded beyond architecture to make it more obviously applicable to other heritage places, although I think it really already does that, and would an illustrated version or guidelines be useful? This paper was written on the premise that strategic effort is required to engender a better shared understanding of how to approach the conservation of modern heritage. This would create more certainty in the heritage system about how to go about identifying, assessing, and physically conserving the heritage of this era, and create greater confidence in the governance systems and for the public. So I'm going to conclude with some questions that are suggested as a starting point to achieve this, and that the working group in this session will be debating tomorrow. How important is it to achieve some degree of universality in approach? Is that just the world according to Susan, or is there some agreement for that? Can we adopt the existing standards and norms for conservation practice for modern heritage? Can we pinpoint specific barriers that are preventing agreement? How can we move past these? Do we need additional specific documents that clearly describe the approach to modern heritage, or can we build on what we've got already? How important is it to achieve How can we embed these approaches more widely in practice? How can we build the capacity of practitioners in terms of understanding and using an appropriate approach? And are there specific text, educational and training initiatives that would help? Most would argue that modern heritage is now a part of the continuum of history and deserves recognition, protection and celebration. But to be successful, I'm suggesting that it needs to be better integrated and embedded into the continuum of general conservation practice as well. Thank you.